So now we're getting to intensive agriculture, or sometimes called high input and high yield farming. So intensive agriculture is high input, high yield farming on permanent farmlands through the use of technologies like irrigation, fertilizer, pesticide, and the plow. So when you have these higher levels of technology, intensive agriculture didn't start just a few thousand years ago. We started using intensive agriculture. It's relatively new, and you can support a very large population on intensive agriculture because you're using a small amount of land to produce a lot of food. But it takes a lot of labor, and it takes a lot of technologies. You have to know irrigation, and if you're just plowing the same field and planting on the same field, you have to understand crop rotation because you're going to diminish the nitrogen and other nutrients in the soil. You have to understand fertilizer, you have to understand pesticides, natural or otherwise, to be able to do this. Now, gender relations start shifting pretty dramatically in intensive agriculture societies. All around the world, as soon as you find an intensive agricultural society, you find very different gender relations. You find very male-dominated gender relationships. Men are the ones working the fields and typically doing all this heavy labor. It tends to be very, very manual labor intensive, controlling the big animals again, and that's seen as a man's job. Men, their strength is you know, up, slightly larger strength. I've told you that there's not that much sexual dimorphism in humans, but there is some, and so they took over a lot of the very heavy, hard to do jobs in these sort of farming communities. So the political systems tend to be centralized. You start seeing stratified society. Some people in the group, there's not a lot of collective farming a lot of the time. Some people in the group have very large fields, other people have very small fields. Some people are politically connected because if you have this very big group of people living together in a city that doesn't move, that never moves, then you start having there's a good side of town and a bad side of town. You need to have a big government in order to control where you throw out your garbage, where you defecate, where you do a lot of things. You need a certain amount of centralized government in order to organize society. So you start seeing that. The group structure is pretty large. You're starting to get populations of several hundred or thousand, so you may not know everybody in the group that you're living with for the first time. This is a big group of people. And they're sedentary. They're not moving around. They were born in one town and probably live there their entire life and never move. But interestingly, intensive agriculture, with all of their technology, they had much poorer health than foragers and horticulturalists. We might think of, oh, this is progress. We're advancing and moving up the chain of technology, and this is good. That must be advantageous. But actually, it wasn't. The places where you start seeing intensive agriculture, people are adopting intensive agriculture not as a new technology that's going to help them, but because they have to. As I said earlier, foragers only spend 20 or 30 hours a week feeding, clothing, and doing all these basic things that humans need. But intensive agriculturalists will do this 60 hours. It takes a lot of work to do this, and the reason they adopt this is because of population pressure. You're starting to get areas of the world where humans have spread out and are increasing in population so rapidly that in order to maintain those very high populations, you need this technology. Okay? So it's adapted sort of haphazardly, and we know that intensive agriculturalists had poorer health than horticulturalists and foragers and pastoralists just by their skeletons. You can see that they had very bad teeth. They're eating a lot of grains and these sort of domesticated plants that are not as healthy for us. They have lots and lots of cavities. Usually they rely on just one or two plants that they're eating. Like they might have an entire agricultural system based on potatoes, for example, and that doesn't give them a variety of nutrients like we would expect from a forager who might be eating tons and tons of different kinds of plants and animals constantly and getting a wide variety of nutrients, sort of like if we just ate potatoes all day every day. And so excuse me. So intensive agriculturalists would come. You look at their skeletons, and some of them are only 4 feet tall, 4.5 feet tall, while foragers are almost as tall as modern humans. They're you and I today. They're very healthy, strong. But They intensive agriculturalists also had lower life expectancies. Disease could come out and wipe out the entire potato crop, for example, and then that would be their main source of food, and there'd be starvation. So this wasn't a great, necessarily a great thing for humanity. It was something that they did reluctantly. This is also when you see the origins of the state. You start seeing cities being built with walls. Now that you have governments, you can actually support an aristocracy, a group of people that don't, you know, necessarily work the land. In intensive agriculture, about 90% of the population will be involved in food production as their main mode of subsistence. So most of them are working in food production, working on the farms. But there is a certain group of people that are artisans, and they are government officials, and they are blacksmiths and these other kinds of things, which is how you start seeing technologies advance. It freed a certain subset of the population to work on other things. And you also start seeing the development of armies. So then you start seeing, military and expeditions and certain towns going over to take over other towns, and it's the beginning of what we call civilization. Like, I don't really like that term because I think foragers were perfectly civilized people. We don't like to call them brutes or barbarians or those words that we've heard anthropologists use before. But it's the basic a form of it's the beginning of civilization, a form of society based on cities as the center of administration and the focus of social life, usually dependent on intensive agriculture in the surrounding countryside. So industrialism is the newest form that we've been talking about. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink. And it's an economic system and social system based on the production of large quantities of inexpensive manufactured goods and the concentration of employment in urban factories. So this is very new and very radical. It started in the late 1800s and continued up until 1950s, 1960s, and then we started to see deindustrialization in some places like the United States, which we'll talk about. But the main difference between industrialization and intensive agriculture is that industrialism, the vast majority of the population is no longer working in food production. So you have a technological advance where you're using tractors and you're using all these pesticides, and your technology of food production has advanced so much that a very, very small percentage of the population is actually involved in food production. Like today, does anybody know a farmer? Usually I ask the class and nobody raises their hand. Maybe one person knows somebody who had a garden, which doesn't really count. We all still, some people still garden. But now less than like 1/10 of 1% of the entire population of the United States makes all of the food for the rest of society. And they can actually make food so efficiently that we export food. And the United States is a net exporter of food. So, with that food problem solved, everybody's working in factories, and they're, for the very first time, working for wages. And so you get these very different gender relations. Now, in industrial societies, the gender relations do vary quite a bit, but it's much, much more egalitarian in general than agricultural societies, because men and women can start doing a lot of the same kinds of jobs. A woman can build a car or make a whatever it is at the factory just as well as a man, and you start seeing this slow, gradual shift to women working coming out in the United States and working in factories and working in paid labor. And at this point, you also get the political system of the nation state. So you started seeing these walled cities from agricultural societies that were joining forces and becoming these kind of collectivized, city states. Well, now you're starting to see nation states, these very big, highly organized, very large population, urban population nation states like the United States today. So large urban populations, very few people involved in food production, and also a division of labor. While lots of people are working in factories, there's also people that are lawyers. There's blue collar work, there's white collar work, there's and everything in between. So this is something that we're all pretty familiar with. But again, it's very new. A lot of problems with human, again, health is the direct, we're not really meant to be working in factories and just sitting and standing for 9, 10 hours a day, these kinds of things. We're not very well adapted to it.